Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. If you saw my previous Bond book review, then you will know that I was a big fan of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and given that book's especially tragic ending, I was curious to see how Fleming was going to continue the story. We certainly never get a proper movie sequel to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the movie, so I was curious to know if the book was going to be a sequel, or it was just going to be a completely separate adventure with barely a reference to the pretty big thing that happened in the previous story. Anyway, Fleming very much does give us a sequel, and this was one of the books that I knew that the movie adaptation was very different, and I knew that it was the conclusion to the Blofeld trilogy, but other than that, I had no idea what to expect going into You Only Live Twice. So let's get into it right away with the plot. So after the murder of his wife, James Bond is not in terribly good shape. He's not gallivanting around the world, punching people, asking where Blofeld is, and choking girls with bras. He's actually drinking to excess, which is a lot for James Bond. I mean, he drinks to excess at the best of times, never mind when he's depressed. And he's fumbling missions. He seems to have actually, well, lost it, for lack of a better phrase. To make things worse, M is actually considering sacking Bond, but then he's evaluated, and the conclusion is drawn that he needs to be given an especially difficult mission. Not one that's terribly action-packed, but one that requires a great deal of skill, and that, if he succeeds in that mission, it'll kind of snap him out of it. So Bond is sent on kind of like a last chance mission, really, and it's a diplomatic one. He loses his 007 number and is reassigned as 7777. Not quite as catchy, I think we'll all agree. Bond is told to head over to Japan, and the object of the mission is to meet with Tiger Tanaka, the head of Japan's Secret Service, and convince him to hand over information of Soviet radio transmissions, which are codenamed Magic 44. So on the face of it, it is a lesser mission, but Tiger and the Japanese are super reluctant to give up this information, so it's seen as something of an impossible task. And Bond arrives in Japan and meets with Dicko Henderson, who is this brash Australian agent, completely unlike the English gentleman that we see in the movie version. And he's been in Japan for a while, but he's drinking a lot and making crass comments about Japanese culture, and that's basically a large part of the first half of this book. Not just through Henderson, but we get so much kind of travelogue stuff about Japan. I can't think of another Bond book that spends so long on the travelogue. I know that Fleming had visited Japan, and he named Dicko Henderson and Tiger Tanaka after a couple of friends he had with him on that trip, and Fleming was obviously very taken by Japan and a lot of the very different customs and cultures there. Now, I've never been to Japan, so I have no idea how accurate Fleming's perceptions are to what the reality is, but I love all this stuff in Japan. The travelogue aspects of Bond books have always been kind of hit and miss for me. Diamonds Are Forever presents it at its worst, I think. Here, though, it's at its best. Anyway, Dicko introduces Bond to Tiger, and Bond starts building a relationship with the guy, and of course the purpose of Bond's presence there comes up. He wants this information, but it turns out that he actually has no bargaining chip in this negotiation. So Tiger suggests that in exchange for giving the British Secret Service the information, Bond has to assassinate a mysterious figure known as Dr. Shatterhand. So this is where things start to get pretty crazy, because Shatterhand has occupied a Japanese castle and has created a garden of death where he has cultivated a large amount of poisonous plants and given home to many horrible snakes and spiders and various other poisonous things. And we learn that people are traveling to the garden to commit suicide there, and we get a lot here about the problem that Japan has with suicide, and how to kill yourself in the garden is actually seen as quite an honourable thing to do because the deaths there are especially painful and horrible. And again, I don't know much about Japan or Japanese culture, so I don't know if this is a gross exaggeration or misunderstanding from Fleming, but for the purpose of the story, I like it a lot. There are also a good few pages here where Fleming literally just lists all these poisonous plants and the effects that they have and everything, and it's like 4 or 5 pages, and the gist is there's a lot of poisonous plants, don't touch them. That's it. But then there's all this explanation, and I don't know if he just had a textbook, handy, and he had an especially lazy day and just thought, just copy and paste this. Anyway, this suicide hotspot is embarrassing for the Japanese government, and they want Bond to sort it out for them. And looking over the photos of Shatterhand and his wife, Bond realizes that the pair are actually Blofeld and Irma Bunt, the villains from the previous book, and of course the couple responsible for the death of Tracy. I especially love these passages when Tiger is talking to Bond about Shatterhand and his wife, because he'll just be going through like a lot of exposition and details and all this kind of stuff, and then every now and then he'll just pause and he'll be like, but Bond, I first of all I must tell you that I must, take a sidebar here. Mrs. Shatterhand is really ugly. Like, really, really ugly. And Bond's like, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. And Tiger's like, no, but you don't understand just how ugly she is. Think of the most ugly thing you've ever seen in your life, double that and stick an unsightly wart on it, and that is Mrs. Shatterhand. Anyway, knowing that it's Blofeld and Bunt obviously triggers something in Bond and means that the stakes of the mission are much higher. It's a revenge plot, and indeed the whole thing about this Magic 44, this information, just kind of becomes a much less important element of the story, and rightfully so. We want Bond to avenge his dead wife, that's what matters here. So Bond is made up to look like a Japanese man, and he's taught the ways of the ninja by Tiger, and eventually he goes undercover as, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this horribly, Taro Todoroki, a Japanese coal miner who's mute, so we don't have to worry about any, Japanese by way of Scotland, like with Mr. Connery. Bond goes to live with Kissy Suzuki, who is a former Japanese film star who spent some time in Hollywood, and she teaches Bond how to fish with the help of her pet bird, David, named after David Niven, who is called out as being the only nice person in Hollywood, which I quite liked. And I find it interesting that this book was written once the Bond film series had begun, and we have this character, Kissy, talking about like how horrible the movie business is. I think it's quite interesting that Fleming chose to make these statements at this point. So after becoming properly embedded in Japanese life, Bond dons a protective suit and heads to the Garden of Death, and as he makes his way through the large space, we have some quite haunting passages, I think, of various people in the garden dying. Presumably went there voluntarily to kill themselves, and some of them are much better at killing themselves than others. I mean, some of them are really drag out, but it's all like so horrific. It's like genuinely quite engaging and haunting, those passages. Bond stakes out and eventually sees Blofeld, who is looking very different yet again and dressing in a samurai warrior costume to protect himself from all of the various deadly things in the garden. And Bunt is there too, along with some henchmen, and Bond makes his way into the castle but is rumbled by a booby trap, and so he's captured. Bunt identifies him as Bond, and he's nearly killed in a really great suspenseful scene. And then he comes face to face with Blofeld, and the pair actually have an opportunity to chat. Which is significant, because even though this is the third book now with Blofeld in it, it's the first time that Bond has been, is himself talking to Blofeld, who's himself. Bond is not undercover like he was in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I was expecting around this time for Blofeld to reveal some kind of grander plan, like the garden is actually a base for some other kind of operation, or the suicide thing is just a byproduct of him creating a near impenetrable fortress. But no, it turns out he's just completely insane, and he thinks he's doing the world a favor or something. I don't know, he does some kind of mad rambling. So he is about to execute Bond when the pair get into a fight, and Bunt is knocked out, and Bond and Blofeld fight out. It's a really aggressively described sequence, and Bond, of course, gets the upper hand and begins to strangle Blofeld while shouting, "Die, Blofeld, die," as he does it, and then he kills Blofeld. Blofeld is dead. He is then able to blow up the castle, presumably killing Bunt in the explosion, and he escapes but is severely injured. And when he comes to, he's lost his memory. He's then found by Kissy, who just decides to keep him. She decides to hide him in a cave, and when Tiger and Dicko come to investigate, she just says that Bond must have died in the blast, and when they're gone, she starts indoctrinating Bond into believing that he is actually a Japanese fisherman. And then in a bizarre bit of travelogue, at such an unnecessary time, Kissy visits a sex shop because Bond can't get it up, and purchases some aphrodisiac for him, which includes some, frog sweat, which apparently does the trick. This bit with Kissy at the sex shop feels so unnecessary at this point in the book, when things are kind of winding down and we're covering big stretches of time very quickly, and then we get all this detail about this very specific thing. I guess it was just an extra anecdote that Fleming wanted to fit in here. Anyway, the frog sweat really does the trick, and Kissy becomes pregnant with Bond's child, which is a pretty big development, but no time to do more with it, because before Bond's baby is born, he sees a newspaper that references something in Russia, and that triggers some memories for him, and he decides that he's then going to travel to Russia to find himself, and that's where the story ends. On Bond himself, continuing on from the previous book, we get a lot more information about Bond's past, here specifically in the form of an obituary written by M that we see towards the end of the book when everyone thinks that Bond is dead, and it's really interesting. It refers to Bond's parents, his expulsion from Eton, his living with his Aunt Charmaine. It's really an interesting bit of writing, until we get to the end of it, and then there's this really horrible fourth wall breaking bit where the obituary writes that Bond's antics have been, you know, serialized into a collection of books, and, you know, implying that Bond is a real-world figure, which is quite a self-indulgent thing of Fleming to do, and jars with the tone of the rest of the story for me. But that tone is very much reflected in how Bond is during this story. You Only Live Twice is very much a story of rebirth for Bond as he comes out of his depression by being immersed in this completely new and alien culture, and then by the end of the story he is totally reborn as a new man. It's cool seeing Bond's attitude change as the story goes on. Figures like Dicko and Tiger are instrumental in bringing back his sense of humour and, more importantly, his sense of purpose. I love the journey that Bond goes on in this book, and it might well be my favourite representation of the character in any of these books so far. He feels like a real, emotional human, but with an extraordinary resilience and heroic instincts, and I love it. Some other characters I really love in this book, Dicko and Tiger. These are two fantastic allies for Bond to have, and they're so full of personality, of interesting things to say, and Dicko certainly brings a good deal of levity to proceedings. Which is, of course, very important to the early sections of the book, where Bond is still very much depressed. I love Tiger, but some of the conversations he and Bond have, like, go way off tangent sometimes and descend into, like, lamenting about the state of their respective countries. Like, Japan is still affected by its role in World War II, and the British Empire is very much on the decline, and neither of these men seem to be terribly proud about their countries. But there are times where the conversation kind of descends into, like, this childish arguing, and it gets, like, Bond will be like, hey, sushi, like, what's up with that? Why are you guys eating raw fish? And then Tiger's like, oh yeah, well, jellied eels, you know, that's weird, isn't it? And, oh yeah, well, why do all the men here wear dresses? And, you know, like, oh no, those are kimonos, you know that. And then they go into some history, and it just gets really, like, childish, you know, bickering, until they both just sort of, like, finish the argument by saying, like, actually, you know what, both of our countries are shit, never mind. Kissy Suzuki is a really intriguing character, and even though she isn't in the book all that much, she has such a great presence, and I think she's second only to Tiffany Case as my favourite Bond girl in the book series so far. It's saying a lot that even when she's doing something so completely crazy, like basically kidnapping and brainwashing Bond, for the fact that she loves him and wants to be with him, I still quite like her. Then, of course, there is Blofeld and Bunt, and Blofeld is completely off the rails here. I don't know if we're supposed to think that his previous encounter with Bond has, like, sent him off the deep end, but he's probably the most insane villain Bond has ever actually gone up against. I've gone on about how the description of him in Thunderball is my favourite representation of that character in any kind of media, and while this version of Blofeld is unlike anything I've experienced in the series regarding that character, I still think he's a great villain. Bunt is more or less the same as she was, except she's much more affectionate of Blofeld, and they're man and wife now, and that's obviously a deliberate move, and it's an interesting position for Bond to be in. This pair were the ones, you know, restricting him of happiness with a wife, and now he's up against this, like, deranged, hideous married couple who are just completely grotesque and have sickening pet names for each other. They're a great evil couple for Bond to go up against. When it comes to the film adaptation, a great deal of liberties were taken. I mean, both stories are primarily set in Japan, and there are characters named the same, but aside from that, there's really not all that much in common. Of course, the films were done in a different order to the books, so all the depression stuff wouldn't have made sense adapting into a film before Bond was married, and the film is more of a conventional mission without much in the way of deeply personal stakes for Bond. I really love both the film and the book, even though they are completely different beasts. I've commented before that some Bond stories can feel a little samey, and even though they're incredibly enjoyable in their own rights, something like Goldfinger did feel sort of like, oh, well, you know, here we are again, different mission, but we more or less know what to expect. We know the gist of it by now. You Only Live Twice has its own identity, and I love it for that. The book plays almost like a fantasy. There's this really compelling alien setting of 60s Japan, and the Garden of Death is very nightmarish, and even little flourishes, like there's a bit where Bond and Kissy visit a shrine to pray for, you know, good luck, and it's made of stone, and Kissy does her little, you know, prayer for good fortune, and when it's done, Bond feels like he sees the statue nod approval. And when Kissy, they're walking back, and then Kissy says, oh, did you see the statue nod? And Bond says no. Of course, we're not really in fantasy land, and things like that are kind of open to interpretation, but it's just the whole mood, the whole vibe of this book is so dreamlike. Since finishing the book and reading reviews about it and, you know, stuff, I know that You Only Live Twice doesn't have the best of reputations in the book series. I adored it, I loved it, and when I get to ranking these stories, it's going to come quite high. It's a great sequel to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I'm really intrigued to find out what happens next. There's really a feeling of finality to the story, and I thought it was just going to end with Bond, like, living, you know, the rest of his days as a Japanese fisherman with Kissy. But no, he's off to Russia, and I can't wait to see what happens with him there in The Man with the Golden Gun. So I already know from comments on previous videos that I'm not the only fan of this one. I know that there are some other fans out there. And if you would like to let me know your thoughts on the book, then please do leave a comment below. And also below you can find links to my Facebook page and my Twitter if you want to follow me on those. And then, of course, there is my Patreon page. If you would like to support me on there, please do follow the link below. And until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.